Hello everyone, welcome back to our series Understanding CBET. I want to thank our subscribers. We managed to reach our target of the earlier target we made of 300. So I want to echo and appreciate everyone who have subscribed and supporting the channel. And today we are setting a new challenge on reaching 500 subscribers. So let's continue to subscribe, like the channel, and of course share with others. So let's continue from where we left in our previous video. We are continuing to look at principle number 4 of CBET, and that is assessment of learning outcomes. And you have been looking at support materials. You're still planning. You already developed some of the tools from assessment plans to performance criteria weighting, assessment requirements. And you have reached to a point where now we now need to develop written assessments. So today I want us to focus on some nitty-gritty about written assessments when it comes to assessing learning outcomes. So when you talk about assessment of learning outcomes, so using written assessment tools, there's some aspects that we need to understand, and that's what we call domains of learning. So when you're assessing, possibly you want to assess the three levels of domains of learning, from cognitive domain to affective domain and psychomotor domains. But most importantly, when you're talking about written assessment, you want to factor much of the cognitive domain. When you're talking about that, we'll be talking about what we call Bloom's taxonomy. And these are developed to provide a common language for trainers or teachers to discuss and exchange uh, learning and assessment methods. So basically, they're just language that we need to use to assess certain cognitive areas of the learning during assessment. So basically, that's what we talk about taxonomy or Bloom's taxonomy. And when I talk about Bloom's taxonomy, focusing on the cognitive domain of learning, there are specific 6 areas that you need to assess. Depending on the qualification levels, so either dealing with level 3, 4, 5, or 6, depends on which levels of cognitive domain that you want to assess. So basically, when talking about cognitive domains, there are 6 areas that you need to look at, from knowledge, understanding, in other words, comprehension, application, analysis, synthesis, or sometimes called evaluation, and creation. In other books, it's called evaluation. So these specific areas, depending on which levels that you want to set your assessment tools, then you need to factor these 6 areas. And I'm talking about 6 areas. What are the terminologies that you're going to use to rephrase your questions? And here I'm talking about specific verbs that you're going to use to bring about that specific level that you want to assess. So if you're talking about knowledge, then certain verbs like define, identify, describe, recognize, list, all those will fall under knowledge. If you're talking about comprehension, summarize, interpret, explain, cite, will focus on understanding. So as you're moving up the ladder, we're now talking about creation. Then you'll be looking at using the verbs like design, modify, role play. Can you develop? Can you rewrite? Can you invent? So basically, those type of questions will automatically assess some specific areas in the cognitive domain. So it's good at any point you need to refer to your cognitive domains which area you want to assess, and it is pegged on which qualification. So if you're talking about qualification like level 6, you want to assess, and that is the assumption, areas from analysis to evaluation. So the higher hierarchy of cognitive domains. So when you're dealing with level 3s and 4, probably you want to focus on knowledge and on just understanding. And you're going to see how this affects your assessments, especially when you're going to develop a very important tool, what we call table specification. It can mean your exam is either easy, or if you go to the higher hierarchy, then your exams become so difficult. So what is the average or in between to ensure that your exams or your written assessments are not that easy and not that difficult? So it's how you distribute your questions based on the cognitive domain. I'll repeat again. So if you're developing assessment tools, focus on your area, and you're going to look at uh, how then do I know which level is suited for what cognitive domain that I need to assess. So first, you need to familiarize yourself with your occupational standard and see which verbs have been used for different levels. And that will help you to come up with the right questions to assess the right competency. And that is basically what Bloom's taxonomy is all about. And of course, there are different forms of written assessments, and one is formative. And you're talking about formative, basically sometimes called assessment for learning. So you want to assess your learning outcomes during your content delivery. So it constitutes the major continuous assessment tests and could be both written or practicals. So you need to, for CBET, it's recommended you do both written and practicals. And of course, there's no limit to how many formative assessments you need to have. But again, that depends with your performance criteria. So if you remember, we talked about the total marks that you're going to allocate will help you to know how many assessments that I need to do. But again, there is no limit to that. And these are usually institution or polytechnics that are involved. So basically, this is what we do internally in our colleges. And CBET, if you look at the guideline, they talk about you need to at least assess 80% of critical aspects. So 80% of all the critical aspects. And we did talk about critical aspects. I'll refer you to that video on critical aspects and why it is important you focus on those specific critical aspects. At least 80% of them need to be assessed. Bearing that in mind, another form of written assessment is summative assessments. And sometimes they're called assessment of learning. And this constitutes the end of term module assessments or exams. So at the end of that module, you're going to have summative assessments. Usually it's both written and practicals, especially for core units of different unit of competencies. Then you need to develop both written and practicals. And usually TVET CDAC is involved. So you'll be called upon as a trainer in a particular qualification. You'll be called upon to develop some of these tools. And that's what you're going to look at moving forward. If given opportunity, how do you develop these assessment tools? And if you look at the guidelines, it talks about at least 80% of critical aspects need to be assessed. And if by chance you need to say, what about the 20%? You need to give reasons why uh, they were not assessed. So we're going to look at that when we develop summative exams. So basically, these are the two forms of written assessments. And of course, there are considerations that you need to have in mind when you're developing the both assessment tools, both formative and summative. One is you need to familiarize with the TVET CDAP guidelines on written assessments. So there are specific areas that you need to familiarize, like how much of the critical aspect that I need to assess. Yeah. How should I format my documents? What are the fonts? How should be the cover page look like? So you need to familiarize with the TVET CDAP guideline. And that's the next thing you're going to look at. Number two, you need to have our benchmark, and that is occupational standard. So all the assessment that you're going to develop should refer you back to occupational standards. So that is our document to use. And usually what supports occupational standard is a curriculum. And why do you need a curriculum when you're developing written assessments? You realize that you need to understand the scope of what performance criteria needs. So it's always good when you look at your occupational standard, also refer to curriculum so that you understand the scope of where you need to assess at any particular point. So basically, something again, you need to have basic templates so that you bring about uniformity when you're developing the written assessments. So basically, that is what we need to know about written assessments. So moving forward in our next video, we are now going to develop at least a written assessment based on our performance criteria so that we're able to see how do we develop questions, how do we give marks or scores to those particular questions. So thank you for your time and thank you for supporting the channel. Let's continue to subscribe, share, comment, and like. Let's meet in our next video. Thank you.